Spring 1932. A basement speakeasy on West 139th Street, 3 blocks from the Savoy Ballroom. The kind of place where the bartender knows your order before you sit down. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, already known as Bumpy to everyone who matters, stands near the back exit. He's 34, dressed in a tailored gray suit that doesn't quite hide the bulge at his hip. The room smells like bootleg gin and hair pomade. A radio plays Fletcher Henderson low enough that you can still hear footsteps on the stairs. A white man in a police sergeant's uniform walks in. He doesn't remove his cap. That's the first signal. The second is how he scans the room like he's counting inventory. Bumpy watches him approach a corner table where 3 men are playing tonk for nickels. The sergeant says something. One of the men stands, reaches into his jacket. Before he can pull out whatever he's reaching for, Bumpy is already moving, not running. Walking. Controlled. He crosses the room in 8 seconds, puts his hand on the standing man's shoulder, and basically tells him, "You're in the wrong part of this conversation." The sergeant turns. Bumpy hands him an envelope. White, unsealed, thick enough that everyone in the room knows what's inside. The sergeant counts it right there, doesn't hide it. When he's satisfied, he leaves without a word. The man, who almost pulled a weapon, looks at Bumpy like he just watched someone defuse a bomb. Because he did. What they did not know was that the woman who put that cash in Bumpy's hand that morning controlled more money than half the legitimate businesses in Harlem. And she was about to turn this kind of intervention into a system that would make the NYPD beg for mercy. If you want more stories where small moments ignite big wars, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me who you think really ran Harlem in 1932. Trust me, most people get it wrong. Chapter 1. The World Before the Machine. To understand what Bumpy walked into, you need to understand what Harlem looked like in 1930. The numbers racket, also called policy, was everywhere. It worked like this. You picked a 3-digit number between 0, 0, 0, and 999. You placed a bet, usually a nickel or a dime, with a local runner. Every day, a winning number was drawn based on published financial figures. Sometimes the last 3 digits of the New York clearinghouse totals, sometimes racetrack results. If your number hit, you won 6-0-2-1, sometimes more. The math was terrible for players. The house always won long term, but it didn't matter. In a neighborhood where banks wouldn't give you a loan and most jobs paid starvation wages, the numbers gave you a shot. And it gave you something else, a reason to dream in specific terms. People played their address, their birthday, numbers they saw in dreams, numbers their grandmother whispered on her deathbed. By 1930, millions of dollars moved through Harlem's numbers every year. Most of it was controlled by small-time operators, men who ran a few blocks, kept bad records, and got shaken down by cops or robbed by rivals every other month. Stephanie St. Clair was different. Born in Martinique, she'd arrived in Harlem in the early 1920s with almost nothing. By 1930, she controlled a numbers operation that stretched across 40 blocks of central Harlem. She kept meticulous records. She paid her runners on time. She reinvested profits into the community, funded churches, paid rent for families facing eviction, hired locals who couldn't get legitimate work, and she was ruthless. Accounts differ on exactly how she built her organization, but what we can say for sure is this. By the time Bumpy Johnson got out of Sing Sing in 1930, Stephanie St. Clair was the most powerful numbers banker in Harlem. She employed hundreds of runners. She owned properties. She had enough cash to hire lawyers who made police captains nervous. But she had 3 problems. First, the NYPD, Corrupt cops were everywhere, demanding payoffs that got bigger every month. Some precincts treated Harlem like a personal ATM. They'd arrest runners, seize betting slips, and demand thousands of dollars to make charges disappear. Second, white mobsters. Dutch Schultz, the Bronx beer baron, was looking south. He saw Harlem's numbers rackets pulling in more clean cash than bootlegging, and he wanted in. He had guns, political connections, and a willingness to use violence that made even other gangsters uncomfortable. Third, she needed muscle that could think. Most enforcers in the rackets were large men with small imaginations. They could intimidate, they could hurt people, but they couldn't read a room, couldn't negotiate, couldn't turn a confrontation into a solution. Clair needed someone who could do all three. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had just finished a stretch in Sing Sing for robbery. He was smart, self-educated, a voracious reader, someone who could quote Shakespeare and calculate betting odds in his head. He was also dangerous in a way that didn't require posturing. People who met him later described a man who seemed calm until the moment he wasn't, and by then it was too late. Later associates claimed that Clair approached Bumpy within weeks of his release. She offered him a job, not as a street runner, as her chief enforcer, the man who would protect her operation, collect debts, and make sure that anyone thinking about crossing her understood the cost. Bumpy accepted. And that decision turned Harlem's numbers racket from a scattered collection of small-time gamblers into something the police and the mob couldn't ignore. Chapter 2, The Pressure Builds. By late 1931, the pressure on sung. Clair's operation was coming from all sides. Police shakedowns were escalating. One precinct captain, later named in newspaper accounts, was demanding $500 a week just to let runners operate in his territory. That was more than most families made in 6 months. When St. Clair refused to pay the increase, he started arresting her people, not for gambling, for loitering, disorderly conduct, whatever stuck long enough to cost bail money and lawyer fees. The economics of this harassment were brutal. Every arrest meant bail, usually $50 to $100, then lawyer fees, then lost work time. St. Clair was hemorrhaging money just keeping her people out of jail, and the captain knew it. He was trying to bleed her operation dry, force her to either pay up or shut down. Then there were the freelancers, small-time crooks who saw St. Clair's runners carrying cash and thought they'd found easy marks. They were wrong, but they kept trying. Runners were getting robbed at gunpoint, beaten in alleyways, sometimes just having their slips stolen, which meant St. Clair lost not just the day's take, but also her reputation for security. One incident, described in later court testimony, involved 3 men jumping a runner on 132nd Street just after dark. They took $200 in cash and the day's betting slips. The runner fought back, got a broken rib for his trouble. When word spread, other runners started carrying weapons. That led to more arrests, more legal fees, more problems. St. Clair needed someone who could stop the bleeding without making it worse. Someone who understood that protection wasn't just about retaliation. It was about prevention, deterrence, and strategic intervention. And Dutch Schultz was making moves. Schultz didn't ask permission. He sent his own men into Harlem, opened competing numbers operations, and made it clear that anyone working for the Frenchwoman, his term for St. Clair, could either switch employers or face consequences. Some runners took the offer. Others disappeared. Reporters at the time described bodies turning up in alleys, though police reports were conveniently vague about causes of death. Schultz's strategy was textbook territorial expansion. He'd identify St. Clair's most profitable blocks, flood them with his own runners offering better odds, and wait. If St. Clair's people resisted, his enforcers showed up, not to negotiate, to eliminate competition. The violence was escalating faster than St. Clair could respond. She had loyal people, but they were operators and runners, not soldiers. They knew how to take bets, count money, avoid police. They didn't know how to fight a war. St. Clair needed to send a message, not just to the people threatening her operation, but to the community that depended on her. She needed to prove that working for her was safer than working for anyone else. That loyalty would be rewarded. That betrayal would be answered. That's where Bumpy came in. The most repeated version of his early work for St. Clair goes like this. He didn't start with violence. He started with presence. He'd show up where problems were brewing, a bar where a rival operator was trying to recruit runners, a street corner where cops were harassing bettors, a storefront where someone owed money and thought they could hide. He'd stand there, wait, let people see him, and most of the time, that was enough. His physical presence helped. He was 6 feet tall, athletically built, with a scar on his left cheek from a prison fight years earlier. But it wasn't just intimidation. It was the way he carried himself, alert but not aggressive, observant but not paranoid. People who encountered him said he had a way of making you aware that he'd already calculated 3 different ways the situation could go wrong and how he'd respond to each one. When presence wasn't enough, Bumpy had a method. He believed in proportional response. If someone stole betting slips, he'd take the money back plus interest, but he wouldn't break bones unless they resisted. If someone threatened a runner, he'd make sure that person understood they'd picked the wrong target, but he wouldn't escalate to murder unless absolutely necessary. And, critically, he made sure everyone knew why consequences happened. There was always a reason, always a logic. This wasn't random violence. It was enforcement of clear rules. One runner who worked for St. Clair during this period, later interviewed for a historical project, described an incident where he'd been robbed twice in 1 week by the same 2 men. He reported it to Bumpy. Within 24 hours, the robbers had returned the money with an extra $50 and an apology. They never explained what Bumpy had said or done. They didn't need to. The message was clear. Robbing St. Clair's people cost more than you could possibly gain. That precision, knowing exactly how much force to use, no more and no less, became Bumpy's signature. It made him efficient. More importantly, it made him predictable. And in the criminal underworld, predictability is trust. Runners knew that if they followed St. Clair's rules, Bumpy would protect them. Rivals knew that if they crossed lines, Bumpy would respond proportionally, but inevitably. The community noticed. Within 6 months of Bumpy taking the job, St. Clair's operation was running smoother than it ever had. Runners felt safe. Payouts were reliable. Even people who didn't gamble knew that St. Clair's people didn't cause trouble in the neighborhood. They solved it. Street vendors who'd been shaken down by freelance thieves suddenly found those thieves had moved to other neighborhoods. Store owners who'd been dealing with protection rackets from small-time operators found those operators had mysteriously decided to work legitimate jobs. It wasn't that Bumpy made Harlem safe. This was still the early 1930s, still the Depression, still a neighborhood under intense economic pressure. But he made St. Clair's sphere of influence safer, and people noticed the difference. But that success created a new problem. It made Dutch Schultz angrier. Chapter 3, The Misread. Dutch Schultz looked at Harlem and saw what he always saw. Numbers. revenue, market share. He ran his criminal empire like a business, which meant he analyzed competition the way a factory owner analyzed a rival's production capacity. And when he analyzed Stephanie St. Clair, he made a mistake that would cost him years of effort and a fortune in cash. He assumed she was small, not physically, though she was barely 5 feet tall, something newspapers love to mention, but structurally. Schultz figured St. Clair's operation was like every other numbers racket he'd crushed in the Bronx and Manhattan. A handful of loyal operators, some street muscle, decent cash flow, but no real infrastructure, no political connections, no legal strategy, no staying power. He was wrong on every count. St. Clair had spent years building something that looked like a criminal enterprise, but functioned like a mutual aid society. She knew her runners' families. She attended community meetings. She donated to churches, not for cover, but because she believed in the work. When someone in her organization got arrested, she paid for lawyers, good ones, the kind who knew judges' names and could make evidence disappear. Schultz didn't understand that. He thought loyalty was purchased with fear and money, and while St. Clair used both, she'd built something deeper: obligation. People worked for her because she'd kept their lights on when they couldn't pay rent, because she'd covered hospital bills, because in a city that treated Black Harlem like a problem to be managed, she treated it like a community worth protecting. Schultz also misread Bumpy. He saw an ex-conforcer and assumed Nussel. He didn't see the strategist. Bumpy wasn't just protecting St. Clair's runners. He was studying Schultz's operation. He tracked which cops Schultz paid. He identified which Schultz lieutenants were greedy versus which ones were loyal. Payoff schedules, weak points. And then he waited. In early 1932, Schultz made his first major move. He sent a crew to take over numbers operations on Lenox Avenue between 130th and 135th. 5 blocks, high traffic area, lots of runners. If he controlled that corridor, he could strangle St. Clair's cash flow. The crew arrived on a Monday morning. They were armed. They had a list of St. Clair's runners and instructions to make them switch employers or disappear. By Wednesday, 3 of Schultz's men were in the hospital. One had been beaten so badly, his own crew didn't recognize him. Another had been robbed of $2,000 in cash, his week's collection, and left tied up in a basement. The third was arrested after police coincidentally found stolen goods in his apartment, goods that witnesses later suggested had been planted. The police connection was key. Later court testimony revealed that St. Clair had relationships with certain officers, not the corrupt ones demanding payoffs, but younger cops who'd grown up in Harlem and respected what she did for the neighborhood. They weren't on her payroll exactly, but they weren't hostile either. And when they got anonymous tips about where Dutch Schultz's men might be found with incriminating evidence, they followed up. Schultz pulled his crew back, but he didn't give up. He just changed strategy. And that created the war. Chapter 4. The Hidden Advantage. What Schultz never understood, what he couldn't understand because it wasn't part of his operational worldview, was that St. Clair's real advantage wasn't money or muscle. It was information. She knew everything happening in her territory, not because she had spies everywhere, but because people told her things willingly. A barber would mention that some white guys had been asking questions about numbers runners. A shopkeeper would report seeing unfamiliar cars parked on the block for 3 nights running. A church secretary would pass along rumors about which cops were taking new bribes. This wasn't sophisticated intelligence gathering. It was community awareness operating at scale. St. Clair had built relationships over years, attending funerals, donating to church building funds, helping families with rent when times got hard. People knew her, not as some distant criminal operator, but as someone who'd helped them personally. So when they saw something unusual, they mentioned it, not because they were informants, because they were neighbors protecting their own. St. Di. Clair kept a ledger. Not of bets. Those records were coded and hidden, but of intelligence. Who worked for whom? Who owed money to whom? Who was sleeping with whom? Who drank too much? Who gambled bare earnings? Who had sick relatives and needed cash? That ledger was her real weapon. When Bumpy needed to find someone, she could tell him which bar they'd be at on Thursday nights. When a problem needed solving, she knew who owed her a favor. When police were planning a raid, she got word hours in advance, not from paid informants necessarily, but from people in the community who didn't want their neighbors' businesses destroyed. One account, later shared by a former runner, described how this worked in practice. A new cop arrived at the local precinct, fresh from another borough, ambitious and looking to make his name. He started nosing around, asking questions about numbers operations, building files. Within a week, St. Clair knew his name, his address, where his wife worked, which bar he stopped at after his shift, and that he was 3 months behind on his car payments. She didn't threaten him. She didn't need to. She simply made sure he understood. Through intermediaries, through carefully placed conversations, through the neighborhood grapevine, that she knew. That awareness alone changed his behavior. He still did his job, still made arrests when he had to, but he stopped being aggressive about it. He'd learned the fundamental truth of policing Harlem. You couldn't operate in the neighborhood without the neighborhood knowing everything about you. Schultz operated through fear and compartmentalization. His crews didn't talk to each other. Information moved up the chain slowly. By the time he learned about a problem, it was already 3 problems. St. Clair operated through networks. Everyone talked to everyone, and it all flowed back to her. She processed it, analyzed it, and gave Bumpy exactly what he needed to stay 2 steps ahead. There was something else, too. Legitimacy. Saint. Clair wasn't hiding. She lived in a nice apartment on 7th Avenue. She dressed well, attended social events, spoke to reporters when they asked questions. She portrayed herself as a businesswoman serving a community need, which, in a way, she was. The numbers racket was illegal, but it wasn't immoral in the eyes of most Harlem residents. It was just gambling. Harmless. Certainly less harmful than the loan sharks and slumlords who bled the neighborhood dry with legal impunity. When a reporter from the Amsterdam News interviewed her in 1933, one of the few recorded interviews she gave, she framed her operation in economic terms. The numbers gave people hope. It employed hundreds of locals. The money stayed in Harlem instead of flowing to white-owned businesses downtown. She wasn't a criminal, she argued. She was an entrepreneur operating in an economy that wouldn't let black people own banks or legitimate businesses. It was a sophisticated argument, and it resonated. Not everyone agreed with it, but enough people did that St. Clair had genuine community support. Church leaders might publicly condemn gambling while privately acknowledging that St. Jim, Clair's donations kept their roofs from leaking. Social workers might disapprove of the numbers racket while recognizing that St. Dry, Clair paid hospital bills for families who couldn't afford them. By contrast, Schultz was a known mobster, a bootlegger, someone who'd killed rivals in beer wars and bragged about it. When he moved into Harlem, people saw an outsider trying to exploit them. When St. Clair fought back, people saw a neighbor defending her turf. That perception mattered. In spring 1933, the conflict escalated. Schultz's men started targeting St. John. Clair's most profitable runners, not to recruit them, but to eliminate them. One runner was shot in the leg and left in an alley. Another was found beaten unconscious. A third disappeared entirely. His body turned up in the East River weeks later. The violence was meant to terrify. Instead, it unified. Runners who might have considered switching to Schultz's operation now refused out of principle. Community members who'd been neutral started actively helping St. Clair, hiding her people, lying to Schultz's crews, tipping off police when they saw suspicious activity, and Bumpy started hitting back harder. He didn't target Schultz directly. That would have started a war St. Clair couldn't win. Instead, he targeted Schultz's infrastructure. He found the apartments where Schultz's men counted money and arranged for police raids. He identified crooked cops who were protecting Schultz's operations and leaked their names to honest officers, or more accurately, to officers who were corrupt but loyal to different interests. He spread rumors that made Schultz's crew paranoid, convinced there were informants in their ranks. One particularly effective tactic, described in later accounts, involved Bumpy identifying which of Schultz's enforcers were causing the most problems, then making sure those enforcers' names appeared in police reports linked to crimes they didn't commit. A stolen car here, a robbery there, nothing major enough to require hard evidence, but enough to get them arrested, questioned, held for a few days. It disrupted Schultz's operations and sowed suspicion. Were the arrests legitimate? Were they being set up? Was someone in their crew talking to police? It was strategic, surgical, and devastatingly effective. By mid-1933, Schultz was spending more money defending his Harlem operations than he was making from them. His crews were demoralized, his reputation was suffering, and he still didn't control the territory he wanted. But the pressure was taking a toll on St. Clair, too. Legal fees were mounting. Some of her runners had been arrested. The constant violence was wearing on everyone. She needed something decisive, a move that would change the entire dynamic. She decided to go public. Chapter 5, The Testimony. Summer 1935. The offices of the New York State Liquor Authority, downtown Manhattan. Not where you'd expect a Harlem numbers queen to make her stand, but Stephanie Sant. Claire understood leverage better than most lawyers. The Liquor Authority was investigating corruption in the NYPD. Specifically, cops who were extorting protection money from speakeasies, nightclubs, and other establishments. It was part of a broader reform push happening in the city, driven by Mayor LaGuardia's administration, and amplified by the earlier Seabury Commission investigations that had exposed systematic police corruption. St. Clair saw an opportunity. She contacted investigators and offered to testify. Not about the numbers racket. She wasn't going to implicate herself, but about police corruption. She had names, dates, amounts. She could detail exactly how certain officers had demanded payoffs, threatened her employees, and run protection schemes across Harlem. The investigators were skeptical. Why would a criminal operator expose police corruption? Wasn't this just a turf war being dressed up as civic responsibility? St. Clair's answer was simple. Because the corrupt cops were worse than she was. They were supposed to uphold the law. Instead, they were shaking down working people for money. At least her operation provided a service. What service did a crooked cop provide except fear? It was a compelling argument and strategically brilliant. By framing herself as a legitimate businesswoman being exploited by corrupt officials, St. Clair positioned herself on the side of reform. She wasn't the problem. The police were the problem. She was just trying to run a business in impossible conditions. The testimony happened in late summer. St. Clair appeared in a tailored suit, spoke clearly, and provided detailed records. She named officers. She described payment schedules. She explained how the protection racket worked, not just in her operation, but across Harlem. One exchange, recorded in newspaper accounts, captured her approach. An investigator asked her how much she paid in police protection annually. She responded with a figure, around $6,000, and then added, "Context. That was more than she spent on rent for all her properties, more than she paid her top lieutenants. It was money being extracted not for any service, but simply because the police had the power to arrest her people at will. It wasn't law enforcement. It was extortion with badges," the investigators pressed. Wasn't she admitting to running an illegal gambling operation? St. Clair acknowledged that the numbers racket was illegal, yes, but she also pointed out that gambling laws were selectively enforced. Rich white men played poker in private clubs without fear of arrest. Working-class black people played the numbers and got raided. The law wasn't the problem. The selective enforcement was the problem. It was a sophisticated defense, not denying criminality, but contextualizing it within broader systems of racial and economic inequality. And it worked. The newspapers loved it. "Harlem's Queen of Policy exposes police graft," ran one headline. Another called her the French woman who made cops tweet. The coverage portrayed her as a colorful character, certainly, but also as someone exposing real corruption. The fact that she was a criminal herself became almost secondary to the story of police extortion she was revealing. Several officers were disciplined. A few were dismissed. It wasn't a complete house cleaning, but it was enough to send a message. Clair wasn't just a criminal operator who could be pushed around. She had power. She had information. And she was willing to burn bridges to protect her territory. The ripple effects were immediate. Cops who'd been planning to shake down Harlem operators reconsidered. If St. Clair could expose corrupt officers and get them fired, what was to stop other operators from doing the same? The protection racket didn't end, but it got quieter, more careful. The era of cops walking into speakeasies and openly demanding envelopes, that was over. For Bumpy, this was a masterclass in strategic warfare. St. Clair had taken a weakness, her illegal operation, and turned it into leverage. She'd exposed her enemy's hypocrisy, gained public sympathy, and disrupted the protection racket that had been bleeding her dry. And she'd done it all without firing a shot. It was exactly the kind of thinking that made St. Clair exceptional. Violence had its place. Bumpy proved that. But violence alone couldn't win this kind of war. You needed political awareness. You needed to understand how to use systems against themselves. You needed to recognize that sometimes the best weapon wasn't a gun. It was information delivered to the right audience at the right time. Schultz watched all this happen and realized he'd miscalculated badly. St. Clair wasn't just running a criminal enterprise. She was running a political operation with criminal funding. She had community support, media access, and just enough legitimacy to make her untouchable through traditional mob tactics. He tried one more time. In late 1935, he sent word that he wanted to meet with St. Clair directly. He'd buy her out, pay her a lump sum, let her retire comfortably, and he'd take over the operation. St. Clair's response, according to multiple accounts, was brief and clear. She wasn't for sale. Schultz's reply was to increase pressure, more violence, more intimidation, more attempts to poach runners and disrupt operations. But by then, Bumpy had built something Schultz couldn't match, a protection network that was faster, smarter, and more embedded in the community than anything Schultz could create. When Schultz's men showed up, they were outnumbered. When they tried to operate in secret, someone always saw them. When they thought they'd found a weak point, Bumpy was already there, closing it. The war of attrition was grinding Schultz down. He was hemorrhaging money on operations that weren't producing returns. His reputation was suffering, not just in Harlem, but across New York's criminal underworld. He picked a fight he couldn't win, and everyone knew it. And then, in October 1935, someone shot Dutch Schultz. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. Dutch Schultz was murdered on October 23, 1935, in a Newark chop house. The killers were mob associates, part of an internal power struggle in organized crime. Schultz had been making enemies across the New York underworld, and eventually, those enemies decided he was too volatile to keep alive. The killing had nothing to do with St. Clair or Bumpy directly, but it solved their biggest problem. With Schultz dead, his Harlem operations collapsed. His lieutenants fought over territory, split into factions, and within months, most of them had either been arrested or pushed out of Harlem by rivals. The vacuum left behind was quickly filled, not by another white mobster, but by the existing numbers operators who'd survived the war. St. D.H. Claire's organization was the strongest of them. She emerged from the conflict with her territory intact, her reputation enhanced, and her community support stronger than ever. Bumpy, meanwhile, had become a legend. People told stories about him, how he'd protected runners, how he'd outsmarted Schultz's crews, how he'd turned what looked like certain defeat into victory through intelligence and strategic violence. He wasn't just an enforcer anymore. He was Harlem's enforcer, the man you called when you had a problem that needed solving. But the victory came with costs. The attention Bumpy had drawn during the war with Schultz made him a target for law enforcement. Federal authorities were starting to pay attention to organized crime in ways they hadn't before. The numbers racket, once treated as a minor vice, was now being investigated as part of larger corruption probes. Bumpy would spend much of the next decade cycling in and out of prison on various charges: narcotics, weapons possession, conspiracy. The specifics varied, but the pattern was clear. The same qualities that made him effective as St. Clair's enforcer also made him a priority target for police, who wanted to prove they were cracking down on organized crime. St. Clair continued operating through the late 1930s, though her dominance gradually waned. New operators emerged. The mob eventually found other ways into Harlem's numbers racket, partnering with local operators rather than trying to muscle them out. The economic model evolved, but the system she and Bumpy built, the idea that a numbers operation could be community-focused, strategically violent, and politically savvy, that became the template. It's how many organized crime operations in black communities structured themselves for decades afterward. Chapter 7. The Scoreboard. Let's be clear about what changed between 1930 and 1935. In 1930, Harlem's numbers racket was fragmented. Dozens of small operators competed for territory. Police shook them down at will. White mobsters saw the neighborhood as an easy target. The money flowing through the community was massive, but most of it left the neighborhood, taken by corrupt cops or white criminals who saw black Harlem as a resource to extract. By 1935, that had changed. St. Clair's organization proved that a numbers operation could defend itself, not just physically, but legally and politically. She'd testified against corrupt police. She'd survived a war with one of New York's most dangerous mobsters. She'd built an operation that reinvested in the community and earned genuine loyalty, not just fear-based compliance. Bumpy was central to that transformation. He provided the muscle, yes, but more importantly, he provided strategic thinking. He understood that protection wasn't just about stopping threats. It was about preventing them, building networks, gathering intelligence, creating systems that made attacking St. Clair's operation more expensive than leaving it alone. The police adjusted their approach. After St. Clair's testimony and the resulting dismissals, the protection racket in Harlem got quieter. Cops still took payoffs, but they were more careful. They couldn't openly shake down numbers operators the way they had before, because St. Clair had proven she'd fight back with more than just guns. The mob adjusted too. After Schultz's death, other organized crime families approached Harlem differently. Instead of trying to take over, they proposed partnerships. They'd provide protection, access to political connections, help with law enforcement, in exchange for a cut of profits. Some operators took those deals. St. Clair refused. The community's relationship with the numbers racket also shifted. It was no longer seen as purely criminal. It was complicated, illegal but necessary, exploitative but also supportive, dangerous but community-oriented. That complexity gave operators like St. Clair room to maneuver. They weren't heroes, but they weren't purely villains either. By the late 1930s, the numbers racket in Harlem was generating an estimated $20 million annually. Most of that money stayed in the neighborhood now, paid to runners, reinvested in businesses, used to support community institutions. It wasn't wealth in any transformative sense, but it was more economic autonomy than the neighborhood had before. And the people who underestimated this, police captains, mobsters, city officials who thought they could control Harlem through simple force, they learned a hard lesson. You can't break what you don't understand. And they never understood that St. Clair wasn't just running a racket. She was building an institution. Bumpy understood. That's why he became indispensable. Chapter 8. The Legacy. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson would become one of the most famous figures in Harlem's underworld history. His career extended well beyond his years with St. Clair. He'd work with other major operators, serve multiple prison sentences, become a mentor to younger criminals, and eventually die of a heart attack in 1968, still active in the rackets. But his foundation was built in those 5 years with Stephanie St. Clair. That's when he learned that criminal operations needed more than violence to survive. They needed strategy. They needed community relationships. They needed political awareness. They needed people who could think 3 moves ahead. St. Clair retired from the numbers racket in the 1940s. She'd made enough money to live comfortably, and the heat from federal investigations was increasing. She spent her later years as a vocal advocate against police corruption, which, given her history, was both ironic and perfectly consistent. She died in 1969. Less than a year after Bumpy, the numbers racket itself eventually faded, replaced by state lotteries and other forms of legal gambling. But the organizational model survived. The idea that criminal enterprises could be community integrated, strategically defensive, and politically engaged, that became standard operating procedure for organized crime in black neighborhoods. You can see it in the heroin networks of the 1960s and 70s. You can see it in the crack trade of the 80s and 90s. The specific products changed, but the structure St. Clair and Bumpy built, the emphasis on community ties, strategic violence, intelligence gathering, political leverage, that stayed consistent. Which brings us back to that basement speakeasy in 1932. Bumpy handing an envelope to a crooked cop. A small moment, almost boring in its simplicity. But that moment represented a system. The cop took that money because he knew Bumpy represented something larger than one enforcer. He represented an organization that could track him, expose him, make his life difficult if he pushed too hard. The envelope wasn't just a payoff. It was a reminder of the rules. And the man who almost pulled a weapon? He learned something that night, too. He learned that, in St. Tom, Clair's operation, violence was managed. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't random. There was a hierarchy, a logic, a system that protected its own and punished threats proportionally. That's what the NYPD and Dutch Schultz missed. They looked at Harlem's numbers racket and saw small-time criminals. They saw easy targets. They saw a problem that could be solved with enough force. They didn't see the institution being built. They didn't see the networks forming. They didn't see people like Bumpy and St. Clair creating something that would outlast them. By the time they understood what they were actually fighting, it was too late. The rules had been rewritten. The neighborhood had organized. And the people who thought they controlled Harlem realized they'd never really controlled anything. They'd just been allowed to operate until someone decided otherwise. That's what this story is really about. Not gangsters and criminals. Not even particularly about Bumpy and St. Clair as individuals. It's about underestimation. About assumptions. About what happens when people in power assume they understand a community better than the community understands itself. Within 5 years, Harlem's numbers and protection machine went from dismissed street gambling to an unavoidable economic institution. It forced the NYPD to change how it policed the neighborhood. It forced white mobsters to negotiate instead of dominate. It proved that even illegal institutions could be strategically sophisticated, community-oriented, and politically powerful. And it showed that the person everyone thinks is just muscle might be the strategist who changes everything. That basement speakeasy moment, that wasn't the beginning. That was the middle of a war most people didn't even know was happening. A war that had already been decided, even if the losers didn't realize it yet. The envelope passed. The cop left. The man who almost made a fatal mistake sat back down at his card game, suddenly aware that he'd just seen power in action. Quiet, controlled, and absolutely unavoidable. Harlem would never be the same.